President Cyril Ramaphosa will be, in a few minutes now, ringing the closing bell of the New York Stock Exchange. We've just listened to him giving and answering some questions, selling South Africa and looking and mentioning the name of former President Nelson Mandela several times. Perhaps let's listen in as that moment is about to take place.
Sorry, there were just having more people inside here. Yep, it's right in here. Just step in here, please. Yep, just step in here, please.
Look at the shot. The real diamond. Let me ask this.
And there you have it, giving you live visuals from New York. President Cyril Ramaphosa preparing there to ring the New York Stock Exchange closing bell, which one would describe similar to the school bells that most of us heard during our school days. The New York Stock Exchange's opening and closing bell marking the beginning and end of each trading day. We're seeing him interact there with several people. And of course, after speaking a great deal, selling South Africa to the world, urging business people to take a look at South Africa anew and emphasizing that South Africa as it stands today is essentially in a new era, addressing the challenges that were detrimental in moving the country forward. Also speaking about how South Africa has been a good company for investment in the past, of course making mention of 600 or so US companies having invested in the South African market, as he sat on the podium answering questions and making mention of Nelson Mandela, selling South Africa, talking about the role that Nelson Mandela played in the country, steering it forward, and also talking about debt management in South Africa, saying that it's important to focus on economic growth so that South Africa's revenue can go up, so that the country borrows less and services debt. But speaking and really selling South Africa on the world stage, being asked about what makes South Africa one that other African countries can emulate. He spoke about South Africa being the most industrialized economy on the continent, and that other countries essentially see South Africa as an example when it comes to the good constitution, one looked at as the best in the world in terms of human rights, foreign policy which is rooted around respect for human rights and sustainable development. We can see him there interacting with his team that he's brought, Minister Ronald Lamola right next to him there, as of course we wait for that essential moment. We have our international correspondent on the other end, in fact in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. A very good evening to you. We've just listened to President Cyril Ramaphosa selling South Africa to the world and saying that he can smell the money as he is in the New York Stock Exchange.
Certainly a very relaxed disposition from the president in a sort of fireside environment with the president of the New York Stock Exchange, who is to his right in our picture. Unfortunately, I cannot be in front of the camera because it's such a tight space we're in here for the media on the New York Exchange, a trading floor. But yeah, just to echo, Paul, what you have said in terms of the message that the president brought in terms of his deliberations with investors, really touting the government of national unity, working together. He talked about the great deal of value there is in working together, the level of confidence, he says, internationally. The business confidence has now gone up. He even talked about ordinary people, right? The point and the premise of these engagements is really to alleviate poverty, to foster greater equity, to deal with endemic unemployment in South Africa. And he talked about how ordinary people feel that we will be able to address their needs. He said, see South Africa's step and development that can be emulated by other countries. He talked about sworn enemies, joking really in a jovial way, talked about sworn enemies that are now working together. He says the level of cooperation has engendered the spirit of Nelson Mandela. He referred to the former president, South Africa's first democratic president, as really having set an example in terms of the very first iteration of government post-1994, which was, of course, a government of national unity. He said South Africa was on the move. The GNU was precisely what was needed for the moment. And he asked American investors for their support. He said, look at South Africa anew. This is a new era. We are addressing challenges. He called it a new journey, a new life, a new chapter. He said there were structural reforms being made. He talked about the neglect that has permeated South Africa's governance over a number of years. He talked about addressing corruption. He talked about rejigging the logistics, which in terms of South Africa's freight and the ability of our ports to deliver en masse. He talked about the rejigging of that. And he also talked about the work that has been done in terms of Eskom and restructuring the state-owned energy company in terms of being able to deal with things like load shedding, which was really an albatross around the neck of South Africa's economy. He talked about rechanging the regulatory framework and the cost of doing business, moving forward, he said, with great speed. Things like visa access, the ability of executives to come and work in South Africa, and taking away the various obstacles that business sees in terms of access to South Africa, entry into South Africa. And he also talked to Paul about how this is our new DNA in terms of the GNU, that this was a new day in South Africa. So very much touting the changes we've seen in South Africa since the election in May. And let me play a commentator here, engaging here on the New York Stock Exchange floor, speaking to traders, getting understanding of how the markets work over here. And we're just moments away. The president will go up to a level above us to ring the closing bell at 4 p.m. local time, 10 p.m. South African time. But as you see, still engaging, but really trying to put South Africa's best foot forward here.
Then they can pull you out easily. Thank you.
And Sherwin, as you talk about some of the highlights of that address, we did hear him really emphasizing the culture and learning the lessons of the kind of leadership of former President Nelson Mandela, as he tied it to the GNU, speaking about how much Nelson Mandela has done for leaders of today, such as himself, to emulate him and essentially walk in his footsteps. But I suppose using and making mention of Nelson Mandela makes South Africa more relatable.
Yeah, it's a really good point. He mentioned the former President Nelson Mandela a number of times, and Paul, I think you can see me on camera now, a very tight space here. And really, I think it's because there is an association that Americans make to the transition that South Africa went through in the early 1990s, right? 1994, the world's attention was on South Africa. You'll recall that at the time, Bill Clinton was the president of South Africa, and Nelson Mandela and Bill Clinton had a very close relationship, a very close friendship. That continued right until his death. And so Nelson Mandela is someone that Americans find that they relate to. They understand the example of Madiba. And so the president leaning on that example really to make the case that this is a South Africa that wants to rejig how it works for the benefit of the masses of people that are still stuck below the poverty line or around the poverty line. The unemployment rate, which has been so endemic, the tepid economic growth that South Africa has experienced over the last decade has simply not met the moment, has simply not dealt with these intractable issues that are bedeviling South Africa's society, right? We have seen political change, but perhaps not the level of economic freedom that so many people in South Africa still desire, and this is very much about that. Even earlier today, in terms of the discussion he had, the roundtable about minerals, right? We're in this renewable future where there's going to be a big drive towards developing new technologies, artificial intelligence, renewable projects, and for those projects to be successful, there's going to be a glut for very rare minerals that many of which will be found in South Africa. And so beneficiation, the ability to create value chains at the local level. You do not just want investors to come in and take out. You want processing to happen at the local level so that development can happen at the source of where those various rare minerals will be extracted. And that was a very strong point made not just by the president today in Paul, but also by the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Parks Tau. You know, I spoke off the live shot with Parks Tau earlier today. We talked about the relationship with the United States. They've been working very hard to ensure that South Africa is part of the renewal that is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which comes up for renewal next year. We talked about the legislation that was mooted in the United States Congress in terms of the Review Bilateral Relations Act because of South Africa's foreign policy. They're working very hard to ensure that there is not an impediment to the relationship based on South Africa's geopolitics. Let's respect each other has been the message, certainly from the likes of Ronald Lamola, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, as we gear up here now for President Ramaphosa to ring the closing bell. After a day's trading here on the New York Stock Exchange floor, downtown Manhattan, this is kind of the hub of where it all happens, right? For quite a moment, let's listen in.
As we listen in, Sherwin, we are counting down the minutes. About 2 minutes left until that bell is essentially rung, closing the day. And of course, it's been one which could be described as a fantastic platform for President Cyril Ramaphosa to speak about South Africa in a very honest way. I mean, he spoke quite a bit about the challenges that we had, how we're straightening out in terms of logistics, the energy sector, and restructuring energy generation to allow private sector investment to play a role in South Africa Inc., he called it, and also speaking a little bit about embarking on structural reforms. As you and I speak, we are counting down the minutes, 30 seconds. Let's listen in.
The New York Stock Exchange, quite a moment after an engagement with the New York Stock Exchange. President talking about South Africa's desire for greater investment, and really just reintroducing South Africa to American investors today. Just a wonderful moment here in New York. The President surrounded by various cabinet ministers from the Government of National Unity, Dr. Dion George, the Environment, Forestries and Fisheries Minister, C. Maropene, Ramaphosa, the Minister responsible for planning, monitoring and evaluation. You see up there Sim Shabalala, the Group Executive of Standard Bank. You also see the new Mayor of Johannesburg, I believe it is, Dada Morene. So, yeah, quite a large contingent of South African government ministers, business executives, as the focus today here in New York has been very much on catalytic efforts to change South Africa's economy so that it benefits the vast majority of people that still do not find themselves in a viable economic position, in particular the high levels of unemployment that South Africa is still